Part 1. The Silence of Old Money. There is a particular coldness that belongs only to America's old money. It does not shout, it does not glitter, it does not announce itself. It waits. It settles into marble corridors and manicured hedges. It lingers in rooms where generations have learned that power does not need noise to be felt. Doris Duke was born into that silence. Her fortune did not simply buy comfort or status. It shaped institutions, redirected economies, and rewrote the social order of an entire region. The Duke name did not merely influence America. It engineered it. From the moment she entered the world on November 22nd, 1912, Doris Duke was no longer just a child. Newspapers crowned her the richest little girl in the world before she could speak. Wealth became her identity long before she could understand what it cost. Her father, James Buchanan Buck Duke, was the architect of that wealth. A man forged by post-Civil War devastation, Buck Duke built an empire from the ashes of ruin. His own father, Washington Duke, returned home from a Union prison camp in 1865 to find his farm destroyed by Sherman's armies. All that remained were 50 cents and a small bag of forgotten tobacco leaves. From a 16 by 8-foot log shed, the Duke family began rolling and selling tobacco by hand. Buck Duke saw something others did not. He understood that the future belonged to machines. In 1885, he acquired James Bonsack's cigarette rolling machine, capable of producing 120,000 cigarettes a day. Competitors clung to tradition. Duke embraced scale. Within 5 years, he controlled 40% of the American cigarette market. In 1890, the American Tobacco Company was born. Addiction became industry. Power became permanent. When the United States Supreme Court dissolved American Tobacco in 1911 for violating antitrust laws, Buck Duke had already moved on. He redirected his fortune into hydroelectric power, creating what would become Duke Power. His wealth survived. His influence expanded. Buck Duke had only one vulnerability: his daughter. When he married Nanaline Holt Inman, her social ambition reshaped the family's lifestyle. They purchased Rough Point in Newport, Rhode Island, overlooking the Atlantic cliffs. A ballroom was added specifically for Doris's future debut. Every detail of her life was planned, curated, and controlled. Doris did not grow up among other children. She grew up among servants, chauffeurs, bodyguards, private tutors, nurses. Her world was insulated, protected, and profoundly lonely. She was not raised to trust. She was raised to observe. On October 10th, 1925, Buck Duke died in his Fifth Avenue mansion. Doris was 13 years old. His will left $17 million to the Duke endowment and between $60 and $100 million to his wife and daughter. Doris Duke became one of the wealthiest children on earth. Along with the money, Buck left his daughter a warning: trust no one. After his death, Doris discovered bags of hidden correspondence, death threats, kidnapping demands, marriage proposals, letters filled with rage, all addressed to her fortune rather than her humanity. She learned early that wealth distorted every human interaction. Love could be purchased, loyalty could be rented, betrayal was always waiting. She inherited 5 major estates: Duke Farms in New Jersey, Rough Point in Newport, a Fifth Avenue mansion in New York, Falcon Lair in Beverly Hills, later Shangri-La in Hawaii. Each became a fortress, not against poverty, but against people. In 1930, during the depths of the Great Depression, 600 guests arrived at Rough Point for Doris Duke's debutante ball. As breadlines stretched across the nation, chandeliers blazed and champagne flowed. The contrast was staggering. Doris did not dance. She watched, she observed, she learned. From the very beginning, Doris Duke understood one truth that would shape the rest of her life. Money could buy anything except certainty, and the silence that surrounded her was not protection. It was a warning. Part 2. A life staged in gold and doubt. Doris Duke entered society during one of the cruelest ironies of American history. In 1930, as breadlines stretched across cities and families slept in doorways, Rough Point blazed with light. 600 guests arrived in silk and diamonds for Doris Duke's debutante ball, dancing beneath chandeliers built specifically for her coming out into society. She did not even dance that night. A tennis injury kept Doris sidelined, watching instead as others celebrated a future she did not yet trust. At her side stood James Cromwell, divorced and 16 years older, a man who would later become her first husband. Even then, she sensed the pattern that would follow her all her life. After I have gone out with a man a few times, Doris would later tell reporters, he begins to tell me how much he loves me. But how can I know if he really means it? How can I ever be sure? Money had made love suspicious. Her marriages followed a familiar rhythm: sudden intensity, rapid commitment, slow disillusionment. Each ended with the same quiet realization that affection in her world was inseparable from access to her wealth. Husbands came and went, but the estates remained. The servants remained. The silence remained. By the late 1950 seconds, Doris Duke had retreated deeper into control. She collected art, architecture, history, and people. Nothing entered her world without approval. Nothing left easily. That was when Eduardo Terrella arrived. A decorated World War II veteran with a Bronze Star, Terrella had reinvented himself as a Hollywood set designer. He understood illusion, atmosphere, and beauty. Doris hired him in 1959 and paid him $43,000 a year, a staggering sum at the time. More than a salary, it was an arrangement of dependency. Terrella designed rooms, curated collections, and shaped the visual identity of all 5 Duke estates. Doris reorganized her living spaces so that he would always be nearby, always available. His taste became her taste. His presence became essential. 7 years passed this way, but by 1966, Terrella wanted out. Hollywood called again. Creative freedom beckoned. Decorating an heiress's endless homes had begun to feel like a gilded cage of its own. Friends warned him that Doris Duke did not handle abandonment well. They were right. On the morning of the 7th of October, 1966, at Rough Point, Terrella told Doris Duke that he was leaving permanently. Servants later said her fury echoed through the mansion. Accusations flew. Her voice sharpened. Terrella remained calm, professional, resolute. Years earlier, according to police reports, Doris had allegedly stabbed a former lover with a butcher knife during a breakup. No charges were filed, but the pattern of rage at rejection had already been documented. By late afternoon, the argument seemed to end. Doris suddenly mentioned a religious artifact at the Black Cat Antique Shop, a 15th century reliquary containing the bones of a martyr. She needed Terrella's professional judgment one last time, she said. One final favor. A Dodge Polara station wagon had been rented, ostensibly to transport Terrella's belongings. It was a heavy vehicle with power steering and automatic transmission, easy to accelerate, difficult to stop quickly. At approximately 5:25 in the evening, they drove toward the gates of Rough Point, Eduardo Terrella at the wheel, Doris Duke in the passenger seat. The wrought iron gates were locked, as always. Terrella stopped 12 to 15 feet before them, shifted into park, pulled the parking brake, and stepped out to unlock the gates. Doris remained inside. She always had. Until that evening. Do you want me to continue to part 3, where eyewitnesses, forensic evidence, and police conduct collide at the gates of Rough Point, or would you like adjustments before proceeding? Part 3, the gates of Rough Point. What happened next would be described for decades as an accident. But on the evening of the 7th of October, 1966, the scene unfolding at the gates of Rough Point did not resemble chance. It resembled chaos, force, and something far more deliberate. As Eduardo Terrella stepped out of the Dodge Polara and walked toward the wrought iron gates, the engine behind him continued to idle. The vehicle had not stalled. It had not rolled. According to Doris Duke herself, this was a routine she had witnessed hundreds of times. He would unlock the gates, she would wait. But that routine broke. 13-year-old Bob Walker was riding his bicycle along Ledge Road, delivering newspapers for the Newport Daily News. As he passed the Duke estate, he heard raised voices, an argument, then silence. Only a few seconds passed before another sound cut through the air. The roar of an engine? According to the police theory formed that night, Doris Duke shifted across the bench seat from passenger to driver. She released the parking brake. She moved the transmission into drive. And she pressed the accelerator. The Dodge Polara surged forward. Witnesses and physical evidence suggested that Terrella was struck with enough force to lift him onto the hood as the vehicle smashed through the iron gates. Blood and tissue would later be found not at the gate itself, but in the center of Bellevue Avenue, indicating where his body actually fell. Bob Walker reported hearing brakes applied briefly at the moment of impact, a deceleration, then another burst of acceleration. He later described hearing screaming as the car moved again. The station wagon ran over Eduardo Terrella's body, dragging him across the pavement before crashing through 20 feet of fencing at the neighboring Quatrell estate and finally slamming into a tree. Officer Edward Angel arrived minutes later to find Doris Duke crying out, repeating the words, "My friend, my friend." Eduardo Terrella lay crushed beneath the rear axle of the vehicle. Paramedic Judith Tom Wortko arrived first on scene. She would later testify that Doris appeared hysterical but only had minor scratches on her face, no heavy bleeding, no severe trauma. This detail would later become critical. Bob Walker approached the scene, offering help. According to his testimony, Doris Duke screamed at him to get away. Each attempt he made to assist was met with increasing hostility until he fled, frightened. That night, Walker tried to tell his father what he had seen. His father stopped him immediately. He warned his son that Doris Duke was dangerous, surrounded by people who could make problems disappear. The message was clear. Silence was safer. Walker would keep that silence for 55 years. At the scene, Sergeant Fred Newton examined the physical evidence. Tire gouges in the gravel suggested extreme acceleration, not an accidental roll. Gate markings indicated a body had been forced upward, consistent with hood impact. The autopsy performed by Dr. James Flanagan the following day revealed catastrophic injuries: multiple skull fractures, massive brain hemorrhage, a crushed torso, broken sternum and ribs, a complete spinal cord tear. Yet Terrella's legs were largely intact. Forensic experts later noted that if he had been pinned between the vehicle and the iron gates, his legs would likely have been pulverized. Instead, the injury pattern suggested he had been struck at speed, lifted onto the hood, then run over after falling. To move the Dodge Polara from its parked position required 4 deliberate actions: releasing the parking brake, shifting gears, removing pressure from the brake pedal, accelerating. Each action required conscious intent. Yet within days, the narrative would change. Do you want Part 4, when the investigation stopped? In the hours after Eduardo Terrella's death, the case did not unfold like a typical vehicular homicide investigation. Procedures that were routine for ordinary citizens seemed optional when applied to Doris Duke. Chief Joseph Richest of the Newport Police Department personally took control of the scene. Instead of separating Doris Duke as a potential suspect, officers escorted her arm in arm back into Rough Point. No immediate formal interrogation took place. No sobriety test was administered. No toxicology screen was ordered. The first 48 hours passed in near silence. Assistant Medical Examiner Dr. Philip Mallister made a decision that would later draw intense criticism. While still responsible for evaluating the cause of death, he agreed to serve as Doris Duke's personal physician. Duke was placed in a private hospital room, effectively shielding her from questioning by state authorities. Mallister told reporters that it was unthinkable to consider anything other than an accident. He claimed Doris Duke had suffered serious facial injuries requiring extensive medical treatment. This directly contradicted what paramedic Judith Tom Wortko had observed at the scene. She reported only minor scratches, no visible bleeding, no injuries consistent with the 30 facial stitches later claimed. Despite the violent nature of the death, Newport police did not conduct a thorough reconstruction. The vehicle was not impounded for extensive testing. Witnesses were not immediately re-interviewed. The boy who had been present, Bob Walker, was not formally questioned. 2 days later, on October 9th, police finally interviewed Doris Duke. She remained in her bedroom at Rough Point, surrounded by attorneys and German shepherds. Lieutenant Frank Walsh and Detective George Watts asked only 4 questions. The entire exchange lasted minutes. By October 12th, just 5 days after the death, Chief Richest publicly declared the case closed. The official conclusion was an unfortunate accident with no evidence of criminal intent. Not everyone agreed. Rhode Island Attorney General Joseph Nugent privately expressed concern about the speed and scope of the investigation. Newport attorney William O'Connell would later claim that pressure from state officials forced Radis to revisit documentation after the fact. According to O'Connell, Doris Duke's attorney, Aram Arabian, suggested drafting a written statement for Duke to sign. The resulting 3-page transcript appeared to have been created retroactively rather than during a real-time interrogation. The document contained factual errors, including Duke's birth date, which she corrected by hand and initialed. To critics, it looked less like a police record and more like a legal shield constructed after the conclusion had already been decided. 8 days after Eduardo Terrella's death, headlines announced Doris Duke's $25,000 donation to restore Newport's cliff walk. Additional gifts followed to Newport Hospital and civic institutions. No court ever established a direct connection between these donations and the closure of the case, but many locals noticed the timing. 7 months later, Chief Radis retired on a modest salary. Within a few years, records showed he had purchased condominium units in Hollywood, Florida, where neighbors included individuals later identified in law enforcement documents as having organized crime connections. Officially, nothing was wrong, but the damage was done. Do you want me to continue to Part 5, covering the civil lawsuit, the shocking jury verdict, and how Eduardo Terrella's family was erased almost as thoroughly as the investigation itself, or would you like any adjustments before we move on? Part 5, Justice Measured in Pocket Change. 5 years after Eduardo Terrella was killed at the gates of Rough Point, his family turned to the only avenue still open to them: civil court. In 1971, Terrella's siblings filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Doris Duke, seeking $2.5 million. It was not revenge, it was recognition. An acknowledgement that a life had been taken and that the official story had failed to account for it. The courtroom quickly revealed the imbalance of power. Doris Duke arrived backed by elite attorneys whose strategy was not to explain what happened at Rough Point, but to diminish the man who died there. Eduardo Terrella's career was scrutinized. His personal life was dissected. His earning potential was questioned, despite his success in Hollywood and his 7 years as the trusted artistic authority over Duke's estates. Duke herself testified that she relied completely on Terrella's judgment for acquisitions worth millions of dollars. She acknowledged his central role in shaping her world. Yet, in the same breath, her legal team argued that his life held limited financial value. The jury deliberated. When the verdict was read, it stunned even seasoned observers: $75,000. That was the total amount awarded for Eduardo Terrella's death. Financial analysts later noted that the sum was less than Doris Duke earned in daily interest on her fortune. After legal fees were deducted, court records showed that each of Terrella's siblings received approximately $5,620. For a brother, for a life. She killed him twice, Terrella's niece Donna Lomangino would later say. First, she destroyed his body. Then she erased his worth. Doris Duke returned to her estates. The gates of Rough Point remained closed. The official ruling of accident stayed intact. In the years that followed, Duke expanded her public legacy. In 1968, she founded the Newport Restoration Foundation, purchasing and restoring more than 80 colonial-era buildings. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis served as vice president, lending social legitimacy to the project. Philanthropy became a shield. History became curated. Friends later claimed that Duke sometimes called members of the Terrella family in moments of distress. These accounts were never verified. What remained verifiable was the imbalance. Eduardo Terrella lay in Holy Cross Cemetery in North Arlington, New Jersey. Doris Duke continued to live among 5 estates. The case faded from headlines, but not from memory. Do you want me to continue to Part 6, covering Doris Duke's final years, the strange circumstances surrounding her own death, and the modern investigation that reopened old wounds decades later, or would you like any revisions before we proceed? Part 6. The silence breaks, but the verdict remains. As the decades passed, Doris Duke aged, but the machinery of her world stayed intact. Control never loosened. Relationships continued to fracture. Loyalty was temporary. Power was permanent. In 1988, at the age of 75, Doris Duke made a decision that baffled even those closest to her. She legally adopted an adult woman named Chandy Hefner, citing spiritual reasons. For a brief period, Hefner appeared to be positioned as heir. Then, just as suddenly, she was disinherited. Lawsuits followed. The pattern repeated. Trust extended. Trust revoked. In her final years, Duke's closest companion became her butler, Bernard Lafferty, hired in 1987. He managed her daily life, medications, and access to the outside world. As her health declined, questions began to surface. On October 28, 1993, Doris Duke died at the age of 80. A nurse later alleged that improper medication administration may have contributed to her death. An investigation was conducted. Officials concluded there was no credible evidence of wrongdoing. The irony was impossible to ignore. Duke's estate was valued at more than $1 billion. From it emerged the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, which would go on to distribute hundreds of millions of dollars to medical research, environmental causes, and the arts. Her name was preserved as a benefactor. Her past remained unresolved. For 54 years, the death of Eduardo Terrella officially remained an accident. Then, in 2018, investigative journalist Peter Lance reopened the story. Lance had begun his career at the Newport Daily News only months after Terrella's death. The case had never left him. His research culminated in a Vanity Fair article and the book Homicide at Rough Point. The work assembled decades of overlooked evidence, contradictions, and testimony that challenged the original ruling. The publication had consequences. In July 2021, Bob Walker, the 13-year-old newspaper boy who had witnessed the events at the gates, finally came forward. He gave a formal statement to Newport police, describing what he heard and saw that evening in 1966. Detective Jack West interviewed Walker for nearly 2 hours. According to police records, his account was initially deemed credible. But in November 2021, Newport police announced that the case would remain closed. Officials stated there was no new evidence sufficient to warrant further review. The gates of Rough Point still stand. Visitors pass through them today. The museum acknowledges the death, but continues to describe it as an accident. Eduardo Terrella remains buried in Holy Cross Cemetery in North Arlington, New Jersey. October 7th, 1966 remains officially the date of an unfortunate accident. Whether history will ever call it something else remains unanswered. Do you want me to combine all parts into one complete TXT file for you? Or would you like a rewritten ending with a stronger hook for audience engagement?